Hello, everyone. This is Betsy Wurzel, your host of Chatting with Betsy on Passionate Rural Talk Radio, where our mantra is to educate, enlighten, and entertain. Passionate Rural Talk Radio is a subsidiary of Global Media Network, LLC. The views of the guest may not represent those of the host or station. Folks, I am so excited to have with me today such a phenomenal guest, an incredible person. My guest today is Dr. Stephen M. Cohn, MD, a former surgeon in the U.S. Army Medical Corps in Desert Storm, past Division Chief of Trauma and Surgical Critical Care at Yale University School of Medicine, past Medical Director of the Ryder Trauma Center in Miami, past Chairman of the Department of Surgery at the University of Texas Health Science Center, and current practitioner in New York City. He has also lent his knowledge as an educator and researcher, having produced more than 300 scientific publications, edited 8 surgical textbooks, conducted extensive funded research, participated in many professional organizations, and served as an editorial reviewer for numerous journals. He is the recipient of Teacher of the Year Awards at Boston University of Massachusetts, Yale, and Northwell Health, and a Lifetime Achievement in Education Award from the University of Miami Department of Surgery. Dr. Stephen M. Cohn is author and writer of this fantastic, awesome book, All Bleeding Stops, Life and Death in the Trauma Unit. I want to welcome you, Dr. Cohn, to Chatting with Betsy.
Well, thank you, Betsy. It's a pleasure to be on your show.
Oh, it is my pleasure and honor. First of all, I want to thank you for serving your country. And I want to thank you for the work that you do. You're a busy guy. How did you have time to write your book?
Well, it's funny. I use a lot of stories to help sort of illuminate the medical students, the residents, and the junior faculty that I work with, so that they understand, some critical aspect of care. And over the years, I sort of collected a lot of them in my head, and they just sort of poured out on the page. So I was fortunate that I didn't have writer's block at all. It was the opposite. Every time I would write one story, I would think of 3 more. And it went easily, and I really enjoyed the process.
I can imagine all the stories that you have, being a trauma surgeon for over 40 years, plus being in Desert Storm, which I want to thank you for serving your country. If I didn't already say that, I just found your book fascinating. I couldn't put it down. I always loved reading about doctors and nurses, and I also liked the quotes that you have at each chapter. How did you decide on the quotes to use for each chapter?
Well, it's funny. I would sort of get an idea in my head, what are we talking about? Well, this section is all about spider bites. And so I would start thinking about it and looking in the literature for interesting quotes that seem to gather up what would be a good way to set off that chapter. So it was by no means scientific. It was more just kind of good salt.
I liked them. I thought that were very apropos for the chapter that you had written. And I have to ask you, because the audience may not know, what does a trauma surgeon do? Yeah, I know you're very busy.
So basically, all of the trauma surgeons are general surgeons. They're not emergency room doctors. Emergency room doctors are, essential people in the healthcare system. They see everyone rolling into the ER with strokes and heart attacks and pneumonia and asthma and all the different kinds of conditions, and some smaller injuries. But the major injuries are taken care of by the trauma surgeons. And in addition, we, at most institutions, do the majority of the emergency general surgery. In addition, we're sort of the glue people in the sense that I would say we're kind of experts in catastrophe. So if someone's bleeding to death in labor and delivery after childbirth, or they lose their airway in the medical intensive care unit, they call us to come up because we're in the hospital. And we also manage patients in the surgical intensive care unit. So we're sort of focusing on the sickest, critically ill surgical population. And while we spend some time down in the trauma center, emergency room, most of our time is spent in the operating room and the ICU managing those patients.
That's, I'm sure, very stressful to have one or more patients coming in with severe traumas, trying to figure out what the trauma is, how to help them. And how do you maintain your stamina for long surgeries and being on call like overnight?
Well, I think in terms of, it's obviously somewhat of a learned thing. We sort of turn our RPMs down and function in a way so that we can conserve energy during the day if things aren't too busy, so that we'll be able to take care of someone at 2:00 in the morning at a high level. And most of us have a good balance so that when we go home we stay in good physical condition and have other outlets so that we can be fresh. But in terms of taking care of patients for 24 hours, it kind of some learned behavior, and conserving energy and getting some rest when you can. I would say that stress is not. Most people that do this for a living are not stressed by it. I think some of it is training, and some of it is the kind of people that enjoy taking care of a sort of a chaotic patient population or chaotic situation of patient care, and aren't stressed and anxious by it. They gravitate to it, and those people that don't want to be bothered by this kind of environment stay away from it. So it doesn't stress me. It can certainly be tiring, but most of the time we're able to manage pretty nicely.
I would think that it takes a special type of personality to be a trauma surgeon, and I just really admire everyone who is, because that is really, it is, to me, when I look at it, a highly stressful job. I have to tell you this funny story. My dad was in Sloan Kettering. He had a 10-hour operation. He had a modified Whipple done. And my mom said to the physician's assistant, they would come out every hour and give you a report. My mom said, "How does he stand for 10 hours? And the PA said, "Oh, he has nice, strong legs."
I think it's interesting, the surgical oncologists that are doing, 8 or 10 hour operations, their expectation for how long the operation is much different from mine. The operations that most of us do in general surgery typically take a couple of hours and no more, because the sicker the patient is, the more abbreviated the procedure needs to be. So we rarely do very long operations. That's more of the people doing, transplantation or cancer work. Those operations can be longer, but ours don't. We have other things going on, like we're doing an operation in the middle of it. 2 trauma patients come in, and so we're running up and down the stairs, operating, taking care of people who are unstable. It can be a little bit chaotic, and that's when you start, can be somewhat tiring. But again, we have backup systems in place so that if a couple of people need to go to the OR at the same time, we can call in a backup surgeon. It doesn't happen frequently, but when it happens, we have systems in place.
I have to ask you this, Dr. Cohn, because I always wonder this. I guess I'm kind of like a unique individual, a little macrame, and maybe a little morbid, some people might think. But I always wanted to know, and I know everyone's different. So in your experience, I'd like to know, what does it feel like to you to have your hands inside a human body and, feeling around with your organs and knowing that you have to find what the problem is and the solution to fix it, and that your life is in your hands? That must be kind of powerful in a way, but how does it make you feel?
I mean, maybe some people, internalize that and feel some satisfaction from that. Honestly, for me, I've always looked at the trauma, and everybody should understand the trauma team is a big team. We're just the quarterback. We're just the one helping to direct care and handing the ball off. But everybody has a key role, and just because I happen to be in the operating room with someone who has a bad problem doesn't mean that my role is necessarily supersedes that of the anesthesiologist or the circulating nurse or the chief resident. Or so I don't take my role in this whole thing too gloriously. And when we do surgery, it's very methodical. So it's not like, I don't think of myself as I have my hands on his aorta. That's not the way that my mind works. I look at it as like, if the whole team does a great job, then we have a success. And it's not like I hold their life in my hands. That never runs across my head. I'll give you an example. Maybe 10 years ago, a woman was in a really bad car crash. A couple of her kids were with her, and they were injured, but they were okay. And she was severely injured to the point where unusually we had to do a thoracotomy. We had to open her chest in the emergency department and then rush her to the operating room. And in the operating room, we had one of the, as I call it, the A team, one of the best anesthesia teams there. And they gave this woman, I think, 150 units of blood in 1 hour.
Wow.
And which is a fantastic amount of blood for that length of time. And she had torn her one of the major veins, the superior mesenteric vein, off the portal vein. This is like the vein that drains all of your intestines. This is like a horrific injury that most people don't survive. So we were able to get initial bleeding under control. She tried to have her heart stop a couple of times. We were able to get her off the table. If she went to the ICU, there we and the ICU team, who I was part of, we were able to, try to correct all of her, physiologic abnormalities, stabilize her, bring her back to the operating room. She went back to the operating room 3 times in the next 24 hours to try and do more surgery to the point where, everything was dealt with. And a year later, she was running on a treadmill.
Wow.
It was the totality of everyone doing their job. The radiologists, the CAT scan techs, the ICU nurses. It's not like one person is the difference between your life and your death. It's really got to all work. So, we're sort of the conductor of the orchestra, but, I don't think any of us look at ourselves in like we're the hero.
I like that. I like the way you look at that, a team, because there is no, as they say, I in the word team, and that is important. That's to right. Work as a team. Very important. Your dad was a doctor, as you stated in your book. Did that influence you in becoming a doctor?
Well, I would say initially it influenced me away from it because he was really Marcus Welby. I mean, he really was the old-time family doctor who had a really busy practice and would go to his patients' homes when they couldn't come in and, make house calls. And he really was a busy guy. And so I wasn't sure, that was for me. And then at some point, I guess between my sophomore and junior year of college, I worked in the hospital as an emergency room ward clerk. And I got to get a sense of the satisfaction that he and everyone got from patient care and the respect they had for him. And at that point, I decided, I think I want to be a physician. But I went to med school thinking, well, I'm going to do, what did I know? I knew what my dad did, which is basically internal medicine, right? And I went to medical school, and the professors would say, so what area of surgery are you going into? And I'd say, no, I'm going to be a family practitioner like my father. They go, no, you're going to be a surgeon. And I would hear that every month. Somebody would say that to me, and I would go I don't know what they're talking about. And then a couple of days into my surgery rotation as a junior medical student, I was like, I get it. This is for me. So they all saw me as having a surgical personality long before I did.
That's incredible. You talk about home visits. I'm 66 years old. I remember the pediatrician coming to my house when I was very young. I was hiding under the bed, doctor.
It doesn't happen too much anymore.
No, it doesn't. What is the training like? How many years do you have to do, residency, or because you call it residency,
Sure.
fellowship?
Yeah. So, the typical is to do, your undergraduate 4 years, and then you do medical school for 4 years. And then the general surgical residencies are 5 years unless you elect to do some research where they could be a little bit longer. That's a minimum. And then you have to do what we call a surgical critical care fellowship, which is really trauma and critical care sort of mixed in. And that's a 1 year, sometimes a 2 year, most of the time a 1 year program. So it takes a few years of training to get to the point of being able to be let loose on the general public.
With all that training, all that you've done, Dr. Cohn, and I know doctors are retiring now because they're probably average doctors, might be my age, and retiring, and it seems so sad that all the wisdom, all the training, all the knowledge, who's going to replace them? Who's going to, there's a country song, who's going to fill their shoes? That's referring to country musicians, but who's going to fill the shoes of all the experienced trauma surgeons that we're going to desperately need?
Yeah. It's funny that you said that. I don't think this is a trauma surgeon or a surgeon thing. This is just physicians in general. The population it continues to grow. One of my when I ran a department, I would say I had a number of 80-year-old surgeons who were basically at the end of their careers, and I used to tell them that they could die, but they weren't allowed to retire because we needed all their wisdom.
Yeah.
And one of my close friends who finished residency with me told me the other day that he's planning to retire. I knew this was coming in the spring, and he's one of the top cancer surgeons in the Northeast, runs a cancer center, and there is nobody to fill his shoes. He has all the wisdom in the world, very technically proficient, and I think it's a shame. I'm going to try and recruit him to at least teach and do some work as a cancer surgeon at the hospital I'm working at, in a kind of a limited role. But he's not doing it for health reasons. He's doing it because at a certain point, it's pressing. And for many people, it's an all or none thing. You either, take care of patients and work like a wild animal, or there's no halftime, there's no rolling back a little bit. In their minds, they can only do it all out or not. So I think that would be really sad to lose all of his wisdom. So I think, many people as they get into their, older years, are thinking about it. Well, I still have the wisdom. as a surgeon, I can still do the work, the technical work, but do I want to put up with the grind? It can be pretty grueling.
Yes, definitely. Which leads me to, how do you prevent burnout? Because a lot of doctors, nurses, they do get burned out, and I'm sure you have to have some kind of hobby, to go home, distress and relax. I know, when I worked as a nurse, and I'm sure doctors had this more so, did I miss something? Did I do the right thing? Do you find yourself sometimes second guessing yourself, or like, I guess I just want to know, how do you prevent burnout and from going crazy, second guessing yourself? I don't know if trauma surgeons do, but
no. So those are two different questions, and they're both really good questions. Let me take the second one first.
Sure.
All surgeons, but particularly trauma surgeons, have to have what I call a really small rearview mirror. You have to learn from your, judgments, but you have to, and that of others, but you have to carry on. If a patient comes in, death is a way of life in trauma. Patients come in with devastating injuries, and they die in front of you, and you didn't matter. We know, for example, in the war zone, that only about 17% of patients, about 1 in 6, if they had a full operating room 5 feet from them, ready to go after they got injured, would even survive. Okay, so majority of wounds in wartime that kill you are non-survivable, even with everything we know how to do right there. So we can't save everyone, and probably somewhere between 5 and 10% of certainly the bad traumas that come to trauma centers die. But we can't be fixated on that. We do everything according to the basic, protocols. And then if people have a bad outcome, you obviously we have a performance improvement analysis. We look at every death and every complication. And by the way, for your listeners, that happens at every one of the 450 or so trauma centers in the United States. It's required that you have this extensive loop closure performance improvement process, so that if someone has any bad outcome of any sort or falls below the line anywhere, that there's a discussion, there's a whole process. So, we look at it in that way, but in terms of as an individual, you don't have the luxury to do that, because there's 2 more traumas coming in the next 30 minutes. You have another sick person. It's not like you can go home and think about it for 2 days, because you're in the middle of it. I used to say it's like, Captain Sully landing on the Hudson, but, 6 times a day, and sometimes 2 planes at once. So you really have to keep your cool and do things according to, best practice. And so, you compartmentalize. If you have a bad outcome, you move ahead and deal with it. Now, burnout. Burnout is about too much work for surgeons. So if you find yourself on all the time, one of my former chief residents took a job where for November and December, it was like maybe last year, I think, or maybe the year before, November and December, she'd been there for a couple of years, they had her on every day except for 3 in 2 months. And in the hospital overnight for a third of those. I said, you absolutely cannot have a life, cannot have balanced life. And, so she had to leave that job, which was very unfortunate. But, you can work anyone to the point where they burn out. So it's very important for what we do that we have enough faculty and things are distributed fairly and there's enough backup. Otherwise, you can blow your circuits. That burnout is going to happen at a super busy place faster than it's going to happen in other places. That's why you need more people and everything. So, but it's too much work, so there has to be enough time. And then when we go home, we have to. Most of us have a lot of, pursuits. I mean, for me, it's sports and exercise, and I play drums in a band, and like to do photography, and I have a great family, and I'm not minimizing. I mean, the family would be first, and all the other stuff would be after that. But the point is, I think you need to have the ability to leave it at work and come home and have great release.
Yes, finding that balance, and sometimes people might find that really difficult. As a trauma surgeon, and you probably were on call a lot, how did you maintain, going to family outings, being involved with your children's games, if they played games and different activities?
Yeah, so I prioritized that. When they were in high school, I was running a department, so I just sort of tried to design my week so I could go to all their games, and it wasn't unusual for me to go to their game, go back to work, or it was we worked everything out. So it was. I don't think my kids would feel they were neglected. Obviously, Florida depends on where, but a number of times a month I would be on call at night, but I tried to make sure that my schedule allowed me to be at all their important events. And, there was a period of time when I would come home, feed them, give them a bath, read them a story. They'd go to sleep. I'd go back to work, and I did that for a number of years. So that was, it was pressing, but it was fine.
No,
I prioritized them.
That is great. That's really wonderful. I have to ask you about your experience in Desert Storm. I know you were already a trauma surgeon. Is that correct? When you went into Desert Storm, that had to be quite an experience. I think when you were talking about, injuries, people dying in the war, I remember watching MASH, and Hawkeye saying to Colonel Blake he was upset because someone died. And he said, well, there's a rule of war. Young men, well, back then it was mostly men, are going to die. And rule 2 is you can't stop it sometimes, something to that effect. Yeah. And that was really quite a statement, but it has to get to people, at times. How do you, this might sound like an odd question, but how do you desensitize yourself so it doesn't, affect your day-to-day living, your mental health? But then how do you also maintain that degree of humanity, of being able to have compassion at the same time? Right. I think it's a fine line sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, inevitably being able to function when someone's dying requires you to be a little, to be somewhat desensitized to the situation. If you thought about it, it might make you unable to function at the same level, if that makes sense. You don't want to have an anxiety attack while you're trying to take care of someone who needs your expertise. So I think that, people deal with it in different ways, and I think you have to be empathetic and compassionate, but at the same time, maintain your cool and be very methodical in your approach to take care of these patients. And most of us kind of take the attitude, I believe, that if we do everything according to best practice, according to the standard of care, and someone has a bad outcome, and while we're still interested in that everything was done right, and there's only so much you can do. In New York City now, we have this rash of people riding around on mopeds or, motorcycles, these electric bikes, which go very fast, getting hit by cars, and they don't wear helmets, most of them. So they come in with devastating brain injury. And we do everything that we can do, but some of them die. And, we'll have half the ICU filled with the same thing, motorcyclists or moped riders with devastating brain injuries and maybe other injuries, but and that end up dying from the terrible brain injury, terrible brain trauma. And, we do everything we can. We try to, be as understanding as we can be and helpful to the parents or the families. But, our objective is to do everything as, correctly and give the person the opportunity to survive. But there's, we have limits.
Yes. I'm sure you must get like, oh, what were these people thinking, doing what they did? There's a lot of times people cause their own accidents. They drive drunk. They don't wear a helmet. They go through stop signs, right?
Let's talk about that. Okay, so a lot of times someone will ask me, so what are the big improvements you've seen over the last 40 years? And I will go through and talk about how much better the pre-hospital care is and air transport, how much better organized the trauma centers are, how much better the quality of care is when you arrive to the trauma center, in the operating room, all the different things that we know about how best to manage these patients in terms of blood and fluids and antibiotics and whatever else. And I'm sure that's lowered the mortality dramatically, along with the improvements in the roads and the vehicles and everything. But it's still deja vu all over again in so many areas. And you mentioned a couple of them. The per capita death from drunk driving is the same as it was 35 years ago.
Wow.
We have many parts of this country that there aren't even helmet laws. You can ride around a motorcycle without even a helmet. And most people don't die when they crash their motorcycle. They end up with a really bad brain injury and go to a nursing home, breathing out of the side of their neck with a feeding tube for the rest of their days. And this is completely avoidable if they're wearing, a good helmet. And 70% of motorcycle deaths are at under 30 miles an hour, like in the residential area, because it's car versus human. And at low speed. So, it's not Evel Knievel. Another area is seatbelts. There's still one state, New Hampshire, that doesn't even have a seatbelt law. Okay. What else? And then you have to talk about penetrating wounds. The lethality of your fist is much less, unless you're like a professional prize fighter, than a knife, which is orders of magnitude less lethal than a gunshot wound. And we have as many people dying every year from gunshot wounds in the United States as died in the entire Vietnam War. We have mass shootings are up to more than 2 a day now. I think we had 800 plus in 2023, which is worse than it was when I started. Worse. And you don't even hear about all the solitary. The mass shooting has to be 3 or more or something. You don't hear about all the day-to-day ones. I'll just, say that, there's about a 50-50 split when it comes to gun-related deaths. About half of them are young men of color in the inner city. Those are homicides. And the other half are Caucasian older men in rural areas, suicide. And that's pretty much an even split. But when people ask me, well, what should we do about it? I have to remind them that there's no literature on it at all from the United States for the last 25 years. There's nothing written about it. And the reason is that in 1996, when there was a horrible shooting in Tasmania, Australia, of, I don't know, couple of dozen school kids got blown away by some lunatic. And Australia changed all of its gun laws and put in some reasonably strict regulations, and they saw their homicide, suicide, they had zero mass shootings for the next 25 years, and all of their gun violence dropped dramatically and stayed low for 20, 25 years. The United States had a different response. The gun lobby and the NRA went to Congress and had them revoke all the funding for the CDC Injury Center and make it a rule that if you did any research on gun violence, that you could lose all your federal funding for your institutions. So if Hopkins wanted to study gun violence in Baltimore, they were at risk for losing, $500 million a year of federal funding. And so nobody did any research. This is a fact. I'm not making this up.
Yeah,
nobody did.
I believe you.
Yeah, nobody did any research on guns. I mean, so when people ask me, is it the size of the magazines? Is it assault rifles? Is it the time to get your registration cleared? Is it the fact that they have all these gun shows? Is it mental illness? What is it that's the source of all this? My answer is always the same. I have no idea because we're not allowed to study it. This is like as if the cigarette manufacturers, tobacco, had gone to Congress and gotten them to agree to cut funding to any institution studying the link between lung cancer, heart disease, or stroke and smoking cigarettes back in the 60s. What would we know about it? Nothing.
Right, and everyone smoked back then.
That's right. So we're still having, today I heard on the news they're talking. I don't want to be all political here, but this is the reality. They're talking about Uvalde and Robb Elementary School and how they had this big report on how, it's terrible that the police didn't act more quickly and this kind of thing. And almost as an aside, it's we could put some gun control measures in. Really? That's the least important. It's that the police didn't respond correctly, not that somebody had however many weapons on him with however many magazines and everything else. So it seems to me that this is deja vu all over again every night when I'm on call and somebody gets shot.
Yes, and I can imagine it must be very frustrating in a way, seeing the same cases and knowing that there's a way to prevent it. Preventing these tragedies. I cringe, Dr. Cohn, when I see young kids, adults, even riding their bikes. I cringe. Now we're in a helmet. They're looking at their phone. How do you ride a bike and look at your phone? It's just like, right. Oh my goodness. I always wanted to go on a motorcycle. I never did. But if I did, well, not at my age, I won't do it. But it would have had to have been a country road with nobody on the road. Certainly not here in New Jersey. Certainly not on the Turnpike or Parkway when I ride a motorcycle. Nope. Just people, I see this, they don't stop at stop signs. They don't yield. They don't obey traffic laws. And boom, a tragedy happens. It's really things that could be avoidable, drinking and driving, being high and driving. You're right, the injuries, when I was a nurse, I worked in the rehab, tragic, of seeing young college students being paralyzed, had such potential. This young girl, I'll never forget her, she didn't drink. She was hit by a drunk driver, and her life totally ruined. It just makes you so angry. So I could imagine, I get your passion, and I understand it, because it's a shame that a lot of these tragedies, these traumas can be prevented with measures, laws put in place. And I want to thank you for bringing that up, because that is really a sad, in my opinion, a sad state of affairs when people can't investigate because they'll be able to get their funding taken away if they did research. That's really, to me, a travesty. Our time is almost up, and I could talk to you for hours because you're so interesting. So much to talk about that we didn't talk about. But what are your hopes for trauma care?
Say that again. I couldn't hear what you said.
Excuse me. What are your hopes for trauma care and now in the future? Hopes,
yeah. So, yeah. I think that recently I published a textbook on in November, third edition, called Acute Care Surgery and Trauma Evidence-Based Practice. One of my hopes is that we as a group of surgeons will practice based on the available evidence. But one of the things that you learn when you put together one of these books is that the great majority of what we do doesn't have really good science behind it. Now, sometimes that's because it's very hard to study, and sometimes it's because people just don't have the interest or will. And I'll give you a good example. Brain injury, we don't really have any good data to support the way we take care of patients, and I don't think it's really any better, or the outcomes are any better now than they were 40 years ago. So there's an area, 3 million brain injuries a year. Many of them require some kind of intervention. They have very poor outcomes for the bad brain injuries. And I think that they're, I was telling someone the other day, when I was a resident, there was this thing called NSABP, and this was a nationwide breast cancer research project. So that basically every woman that had breast cancer was put onto a protocol. They were evaluated in one of the many arms of this study. And today, the breast cancer specialists know, what the best therapies are, what the best chemotherapy is, what the best kind of surgery is, when to do it. All this stuff has been studied, and huge advances have been made in this very common disease. But breast cancer is not nearly the killer that trauma is. Okay, and so I think we need to have all these brain injury patients on a protocol. They need to all be, part of a national research project. That's what I'd like to see, so that we can have evidence to support what it is that we're doing rather than institutional, style points. So that's one of my hopes. Another hope is that we as a society can start looking at, some of the causes of many of these injuries and deaths in the form of driving while intoxicated. If you get a DUI, they put a breathalyzer on your ignition that you have to blow into to start your car. That could be on every car. They cost $300 for a breathalyzer. So, there's a lot that could be done to avoid driving while intoxicated, and that might have a big impact because it still accounts for 50% of our vehicular deaths, which are a huge number. The helmets you mentioned, we ought to have helmets required for everybody that rides a bike or a motorcycle. It's easily enforceable and has huge positive impact. And then last, we're going to have to at some point address this issue of guns in our communities. And it's going to have to get addressed in some reasonable thoughts. You don't see this in Canada. You drive across the border, you just don't see injuries from guns. Maybe an occasional hunting accident. Someone falls on their weapon and shoots themselves. But this is a very uniquely American problem, and it's going to have to get addressed because we just can't have, Walmarts and churches and schools and you name it. You just go on and on, nightclubs, and think of all of the huge mass shootings that have occurred just in the last couple of years.
Yes.
Astonishing.
Yes. It is. It's really sad. I mean, I could do another show with you, Dr. Cohn, on like mental illness and the red flags that are missed or don't want to be addressed by schools. I've you see it. I worked in a preschool, and I'll tell you what, this little boy doesn't get help, he's going to be, I believe that he's going to be a psychopath, a sociopath, because he got kicked out of a preschool at 3 years old for choking someone. 3 years old. No remorse. He would hurt someone and have no remorse at all. And I'm thinking, this kid needs help. He needs some serious help.
Yep.
But you know what? People just shrug it off. Oh, Betsy, you don't know what you're talking about. You know, we can't say anything, blah, blah, blah. Well, you know what? Remember his name, because he'll be in the news one day. But I want to thank you. I forgot his last name already. I remember his first name. But I want to thank you, Dr. Stephen Cohn, for coming on. I could talk to you for a whole other hour. You are fantastic. I so much admire the work that you do. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for the work that you do and other trauma surgeons and trauma teams around the world. Thank you, and thank you for writing this book. Where can people purchase this book, Dr. Cohn?
Well, I know you can get it on, Amazon and Barnes and Noble, and I'm sure, other booksellers and hopefully some bookstores will have it available. And I hope people enjoy the book. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Oh, it's my pleasure and honor. I think they will, folks. I want to highly recommend this book, All Bleeding Stops: Life and Death in the Trauma Unit. Stephen, Stephen, M. Cohn, Cohn, MD. This is a book you will not be able to put down. I recommend this book. Anybody in the medical field, anybody who wants to go into the medical field, even if you're not, read this book and appreciate what trauma surgeons do, their education, their fellowship, their training, how intense it is and what they do and how they help people. Next time, God forbid, if you ever have a trauma, thank your trauma team. Thank your trauma surgeon. It's so necessary to have good trauma surgeons such as you, Dr. Cohn, and it's going to be a sad day when you retire because you have such knowledge, such expertise, and it really was an honor talking to you, and I wish you lots of luck in your book. I hope it becomes a bestseller because I feel that strongly about it. It is a wonderful book. I really enjoyed reading it. You laugh or you cry. You're welcome.
Okay. All right.
You're welcome.
Take care.
All right. Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.
Folks, bye-bye. Thank you. Folks, you heard Dr. Stephen M. Cohn today. All the information will be in the blog that Jeannie White, who's station manager, writes. Excuse me. And Jeannie produces the show. And I want to thank Lillian Caldwell, who's CEO of Passionate World Talk Radio, who makes this all possible. And I want to thank you, the listeners. Please subscribe. It's free if you don't already. The Chatting with Betsy. I am on Spotify, Spreaker, iHeart, YouTube, to name a few, Amazon Music. And please share this show to help other people. I have phenomenal guests here to help you, hopefully, have a better life. And I do have a support group. If you are a caregiver, #Kick Alzheimer's Ass Movement group on Facebook. And you can follow me on Facebook, Betsy E. Wurzel, Wurzel. And as I always say at the end of my show, in a world where you could be anything, please be kind and shine your light bright, because we all need it more now than ever. Shine your light, folks. Be kind. Let's bring back our humanity. And that's what I have to say. This is Betsy Wurzel, your host of Chatting with Betsy, at Passion World Talk Radio. Thank you for listening. Be safe, everyone. Bye-bye now.